Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. Steve, feel free to sing some music while we wait as everyone's coming into our webinar.
Does knowing what Muzak is date us?
I think it does. That's a little raise your hand if you don't know what Muzak is. All right, why don't we get started? I want to thank you again for coming. Oh, we do have a hand raise. Ooh. Okay, so Muzak is, how would you even explain it, Steve? We have to answer this question now.
Muzak was the name of a company that made pre-recorded music to play over backgrounds in offices and elevators with exactly the musical qualities you'd expect to be played in elevators and stuff. People say you know that real Muzak, you could tell even if they were playing it through a regular phone speaker, it didn't sound any worse. But that was back when people had regular phones too.
Oh boy, we are old, aren't
That
we?
was based out of Seattle.
All right, well, let's get started because we do have a number of people here now. I want to say welcome to everyone to the Gray Decision Intelligence Demand Trend webinar designed specifically for community college professionals. We have something really special today. We're going to be talking, I'll let Steve elaborate on what we're talking about, but we have some new data in. So he's going to be talking all about that. There are a few housekeeping items to get started with. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a place labeled Q&A. Please feel free to add your questions there. We'll get to as many as we can during the session, and we can certainly follow up later with you if we run out of time. My Gray colleagues and I will be available for chat and questions during the duration of the session. You will receive a link to the webinar recording and presentation slides in the next few days. Please look for it in your email. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Steve Probst, Senior VP at Gray Decision Intelligence. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Marianne. So today's topic is completions trends in higher ed, and we're going to focus on community colleges, technical colleges, other two-year institutions. In terms of the agenda, we're going to start looking at an overview of enrollment and completions trends, and then we're going to work through one degree level at a time. Undergrad certificates and associate degrees, because those are the core kinds of programs at community colleges. We'll also spend a little bit of time looking at data for bachelor's degrees because so many community colleges programs are intended for transfer. So therefore gives you a sense of what the demand is at that end of the process. We're going to skip past the other award levels and wrap up with some summary and conclusions. The analysis we're doing, the reason we're sharing this today, aside from the fact we just find it interesting, is that, as I think many of you know, Gray helps institutions make decisions about academic programs and understand their economics. And we do that by providing a great deal of market, in this case, about the a great deal of data, including about the external market, student demand, employment data, competition. One of the major data sets that feeds that system is released annually in its completions data. It comes from the federal data system from IPEDS. And that data just dropped just about a month ago. When we receive that, we go through a very large validation and enhancement process at the data to make the numbers more apples to apples, both over time and across institutions. So what you're about to see is actually our first public presentation of what the completions through the most recent year that's available, 2023, look like and what those trends have been over time. So starting point is actually not going to be with completions. I'm going to back up a bit to the prospective students that we look at. For our traditional students, the bars here are high school graduates. And I'm sure you've all heard about the so-called enrollment cliff. And what this data basically shows is the number of high school graduates was rising, but it's basically flattened out, and at some point it's going to start declining. Interestingly enough, if you look at new first-time enrollment, degree-seeking enrollment, that actually peaked way back around 2010 and has been on a slow decline ever since, with a slight acceleration during COVID for obvious reasons. So if you have in your mind either that there's an enrollment cliff sometime coming in the future, or that enrollment actually declined starting 15 years ago, the numbers you're going to see now may look a little surprising. What we actually see is that bachelor's degrees awarded, and there's about 2 million a year, peaked in 2021. And by the way, these patterns, I'm using bachelor's just because it's easier to talk about this one level at a time. Bachelor's peaked in 2021 and have been declining the last 2 years. Enrollment, the data we're just looking at, peaked, back here and has been coming down. Well, how's that consistent? And these are new enrollments. Well, the first piece is there's a 4 to 6 year lag from a new enrollment till the bachelor's degree is earned. So there's a whole time shift. But the other thing is this pattern. Completion rates were around 59% going back a number of years, and they've climbed up to the mid 60s. And that alone is worth about an 8-point increase in degree counts awarded for the same level of enrollment. So that rise in the completion rate pushed out the peak in the bachelor's degree completions. But we seem to have taken that as far as we can right now, and it has started trending down. So now let's look at the big overview, all award levels. You're going to see a number of graphs that follow this general layout. At the bottom, you have the year, and we've got 10 years of data, 2013 through 2023. I guess that's 11 years. The count of certificates or degrees awarded is here on the left. At the top, you can see that the number of total degrees and certificates awarded and reported to IPEDS, the federal system, rose from just under 5 million in 2013 to a peak of 5.4 million in 2021, and a very small decline since then. If you look at the colors of the bars, the bottom piece here is undergrad certificates, and there's been a total of a 9% increase in that period of time. The next chunk is associate degrees, and those have declined slightly. And remember, that's over 5 years. That's not 5% a year. It's about 0.5% a year. Bachelor's grew a little bit. So net effect, when you look at the bottom 2/3 or 3/4 of this graph, all the way across, the bars are about the sections of the bars are about the same height, until you see bachelor's kind of rising a bit here and coming back down. But the next segments, you see something different. Graduate certificates, both post-baccalaureate and postmasters, rose from a tiny number back in 2013 to a not quite tiny number in 2023. They actually almost doubled, up 78%, but still a very small share of the total. Master's degrees has been the heart of growth where there has been growth. It's up 24%, but off a moderate-sized base. And the top piece here, the doctorates, have grown, but they were fairly small and have continued to be small. Overall, over that 11-year period, there was a 9% increase in total reported completions. And in general, there are two things that jump out that are kind of interesting, that are contrasting. One is that looking at these, the mix by award level is essentially unchanged for that time period. Yet, there were big differences in the growth rates, and in particular, the graduate certificates and degrees grew much faster than undergrad. And at the community college level, it was basically a split story. This takes a look at those same award levels and total and looks at it as a compound annual growth rate for the two most recent years, 21 through 2023. So the way to read this is undergrad certificates grew 3.8% a year for the most recent 2 years that we have data for. In contrast, associate degree conferrals dropped at the same rate, that it dropped at negative 3.8% a year. Bachelor's degrees dropped, but not quite as fast. And then grad certificates, master's, and doctoral degrees all grew at about the same rate as the undergrad certificates, 3.5%, doctorates a bit more slowly. The net effect was a very small decline in the total, but the story is very different by the award level. And even for community colleges, very different for undergrad certificates versus associate degrees. This slide takes what we just looked at and compares it to the compound annual growth rates, the annual growth rates from 2018 to 2021. So this is 2 years. This is the 3 years before that, which, by the way, is diving into COVID, whereas this is recovering from COVID. You'll notice at a glance, these two graphs look really different. For the period right before COVID, most levels were growing at somewhere between 0.5% to up to 2% a year. The graduate degrees were growing a bit faster than undergraduate and certificates. But the only thing that really stood out was graduate certificates were growing at a much faster rate than anything else. And we saw it just in the graph before. That's off a fairly small base, but that's still, more than 4 times the growth rate of anything else. And the overall was a gradual increase, 1% a year. So where we're seeing declines now in associate and bachelor's degrees, the previous period we saw small growth. And we're seeing a big increase in undergrad certificates now on an annual basis. In the past, we saw small growth. So there's divergence here that was not apparent 2 years ago. Taking that a step further, this now adds in the 5 years before 2018. So overall, this is 10 years of data. The last 2, the 3 leading up to COVID, and the 5 leading up to that. And the big story here is these 2 graphs look very similar. They both have grad certificates as the fastest growing part, and everything else a bit slower. They have the total market growing at about 1% a year. And actually, undergrad certificates and associate degrees were doing slightly better in the 3 years leading up to COVID than they were before. But I would describe this as all pretty flat in terms of growth or shrinkage. But bachelor's degrees were growing until they weren't. And even master's and doctoral, well, here the growth rate basically doubled. So a big shift in trend versus what we had been seeing. Now we're going to look at it one award level at a time, and we're going to start with undergraduate certificates. So across the bottom, again, we have the years. On the side, we have the number of certificates awarded. And you can see just looking across the top, it was fairly flat, a bit of a decline, came back up, came back down. And then the last few years is where we're seeing that increase that we just saw in the table. The biggest categories, the trades, which include both construction and mechanical repair kinds of trades, but also culinary and cosmetology and so on. For those of you who are IPEDS buffs, the 12s as well as the 46 and 47 and 48s. So the trades are the largest portion, and they've grown about 8% in terms of certificates awarded in this time period. Health-related fields is the next biggest, but they're actually down 30% over this period. In a context where the overall trend was up, this is down dramatically. And if you look at this bright blue bar here, you can see it narrowing. The next one up in a light blue is general. This is general studies. So this is not specifically, an undergrad certificate in English or history. This is a certificate in general studies. And that has gone from infinitesimal to the third biggest category. It's actually up, by 240% above where it was before. I'll take a look at what's driving that in a moment. And then the fourth biggest category is business. That's increased about 46% over that time. Then there's a lot of other areas that are not worth breaking out in this graph that include all the other disciplines. So big story was kind of flat at the top with some recent growth. But inside that, there were some dramatic changes happening with the shrinkage in healthcare and then bouncing back out, and the growth in this general studies certificates. This looks at those same discipline areas, and it calculates the actual drop. So that 30% decline we saw in healthcare certificates was a drop of about 120,000 certificates a year in health-related fields. And to put that in perspective, the total number, we go back one, of certificates awarded in 2013 was about 1 million. So a drop of 120,000 would be a drop of about 12% in the total number of certificates accounted for just by this one category. Nothing else shrank much. On the growth side, general studies, it's about 120,000 increase. This, interestingly enough, it's fairly spread out, but about half of it is in the state of California. These programs appear to be a bundling of gen ed courses that transfer cleanly to the state system colleges, four-year schools, and universities. So it's, in effect, a substitute for a general studies transfer degree, an associate degree for transfer. Now you can transfer with just a certificate, and it's guaranteed transfer, and it's structured for that purpose. And these were minimal before, and we've seen a big increase in those. Moderate increases in the business and trades and computer-related fields, a little bit in engineering and quantitative. So those data analytics programs are here. But the big trends are on the negative side, the healthcare programs, and on the positive side, general studies. Let's take a little bit of a deep dive on what happened with health. These are undergraduate certificate health-related completions. So you see here it dropping from about 400,000 to it bottomed out in 2020 at about 250, 260,000. And then it leveled off, actually came up a bit. The colors here are for the sectors. For-profit and career colleges. Public, that's our community colleges and technical colleges. Not-for-profit is a few things. There are some legitimately not-for-profit 2-year and 1-year institutions. But one of the biggest in here is Ultimate Medical Academy, which is a career college down in Florida, which appears to function as just like the for-profits, but is technically, qualifies as a not-for-profit. So some of this shrinkage you see here is the same pattern you saw there. So basically what happened we see is basically an evaporation of almost half of the health-related certificates that were awarded by for-profit colleges. At the same time, there was a small downward trend at the publics, but much smaller scale than what we saw for the for-profits. Looking at that a little more deeply, the 4 categories here, we had 3 a moment ago. We have public and not-for-profit, but for-profit we've broken into 2 pieces. The light blue for-profits here, going from 22% in the market to 28%, are the schools that were in existence in 2023 as for-profit institutions. The orange piece is for-profit institutions that no longer report any completions. but accounted for 18% of the market. And this is for all undergraduate certificates back 10 years ago. So what we're really seeing with undergrad certificates is the big drop in health was primarily for-profit institutions that have gone out of business, or if you prefer, were put out of business, and they were very strong in programs like certificate in medical assisting. That was the biggest. It used to be the second largest associate or undergrad certificate program in the country. So that's that whole pattern. Looking at a tighter time frame, last 5 years, at the 6-digit SIP programs having shown the most growth. So the top one here, general studies, you see grew by 50,000 certificates per year over the last 5 years. That happened to have been a 70% increase. This is sorted on then the number increase, not the percentage, though most of these are very large percentages too. Esthetician and skincare specialist, a caution with that one, in the nail specialist and manicurist. A lot of credentials in that field are awarded by non-Title IV institutions. And so we may not be picking up all of the competition for these certificates. Electrician and welding tech and the trades have been growing. Truck driver. And then something like business, while it shows some growth, it's off a very large base. It was actually only 12% growth. In contrast to something like cybersecurity, with about the same unit growth, was a doubling in size. Just because something's showing growth doesn't necessarily mean it's a good program. Something like a customer service support call center, I suspect the outcomes for a program like that are not terribly wonderful. This now looks at the growth by institution in undergraduate certificates. So Ivy Tech, the Indiana State Community College system, the number of certificates they award per year rose by 16,000, in this case over a 10-year period. Sinclair, another community college, substantial growth. Next one, Purdue University Global, that's the old Kaplan. Not clear how many of those are undergrad certificates, in the sense that, conventionally we talk about for community college. There may be some of those that are embedded in bachelor's degrees, but still reported. UW-Madison, what is probably there could be two things going on here. One is that we are seeing some institutions, four-year institutions, reporting undergrad certificates as they're embedding them in bachelor's degree programs. We're not seeing all that much of that, though we hear about it. But the other thing is that University of Wisconsin, in the last 10 years, merged all their community college campuses into the state system. So Madison all of a sudden started reporting some of the local community colleges in their data, and that could also report for this. So that would be a reporting change rather than a reality change, potentially, at least some of that, and then can see the others. That takes us through the undergraduate certificate data. Now we'll do a similar look at the data for associate degrees. Big picture here from 2013 through 2021, it was basically dead flat, slight growth in the number of associate degrees awarded nationally. And then in the last 2 years, it has dropped significantly. We saw that was dropping at about 4% a year. The biggest categories here, general studies. This is your classic transfer degree to a 4-year school. At least that's the intent. There's healthcare, and then business, then everything else are smaller categories. So like we saw in the main graphs, big change recently after a very stable trend. And the blocks here by major or by discipline are fairly consistent over time. You're seeing a little bit of shrinkage of health here again, but not an overwhelming amount. If you look at it for which discipline areas are growing and shrinking, As before, health is the one that has declined the most. Whereas before we saw something that was about 120,000 decline, here that decline is much, much smaller. On a positive note, associate degrees in specific sciences, in psychology or family studies kinds of programs, and in general studies, all have been growing, and to a lesser extent, some of these other fields, social sciences, trades. This liberal arts, though, the distinction between this and general, these liberal arts programs are specific. They're English or they're history or they're a foreign language, as opposed to general studies, which also include liberal arts courses, but are not specific to one liberal arts discipline. So what we see here, unlike what we saw with certificates, is a fairly even mix of things growing versus things shrinking over this fairly long period. If we look at it more recently, that 2-year drop, so this period here, are the trends different? What we see is the big decline is in your classic transfer associate degree in general studies, which is, by the way, sometimes labeled associate degree in liberal arts or in humanities, or it sometimes shows up other places like interdisciplinary, other, or general. But that's where the big change, the other changes are much smaller. But the only things that grew in the last 2 years at the associate level were some trades programs and small positive increase in computer-related programs like computer science and information technology and cybersecurity. Somewhat small declines in business, criminal justice, health, social sciences, and so on. So there is some reversal of trends, but this is the one that really stands out, the general studies. So over the last 5 years, the individual programs with the most growth, health services / allied health general has tripled in size, added 6,000 completions a year. That's 6,000 associate degrees awarded a year, increase over the 5-year period. A program like this is sometimes used as a parachute program for folks who are trying to get into, let's say, the associate degree nursing program and either don't get in or don't make it through. But the other place you see this for associate degrees sometimes is as the associate degree completion program for someone who has a certificate in a healthcare area. So there are several different possible explanations for that. Psychology, one of the things that we deal with, I mentioned at the beginning, we do a lot of enhancements to the data. There are some reporting things that people do for various incentives. So at the 4-year level, one of the big things is STEM-related programs have the graduates can stay in the US to work for 3 years instead of 1 year. So we've seen a lot of schools changing the reporting from a non-STEM to a STEM qualified program. So there are some schools that have, if you look at their catalog or on their website, they have a program in psychology, but they're reporting it to this SIP, which is experimental psychology, other. So we put that back where it belongs. But in any case, going on for associate degree, that has showed the second most growth of any specific program at the associate level. Associate degree nursing shows growth. Percentage-wise, it's small because associate degree nursing is huge, but it's still positive growth. Cybersecurity has more than doubled in size in this time period. And it's only the 5 years we're looking at. So that gives you a sense of what's growing. And there's a wild mix of programs here. Some are job focused, some are not, like auto mechanics as opposed to psychology. Some are more male dominant, some are more female dominant, some are in between. So it's an interesting spread here of what's been growing at the associate level. In terms of institutions, one of the rules of thumb when you're doing data is every time you sort something to look at the highest or the lowest or the most change, any sort of ratio. you're likely to find outliers that are just plain weird for special reasons. So Eastern Gateway Community College followed the Turkey growth cycle. It grew and grew and grew. And then last year its head was chopped off and they're shutting down this term. Or literally this month, I believe. They went with an OPM, did a huge launch. Their enrollments went from something like 4,000 total on campus to about 40,000 primarily online. And the feds basically told them they were violating the rules for Pell Grants, and they could not resolve that. Ultimate Medical Academy, that's the one I mentioned earlier, showing a lot of growth, that reports as a not-for-profit, but behaviorally and program-wise and so on seems to look like a for-profit career college. Then we have a bunch of community college and community college systems. You've got Southern New Hampshire offering associate degrees and growing there. So an interesting mix of kinds of schools, some of which are more likely to persist than others. If we look at this by sector, looking associate and undergrad certificate, this top line here is public institutions, associate and below. Now, our sectors here are not quite the standard sectors you're used to seeing. Public, for-profit, and not-for-profit are, which goes into other in this case, are the most recent designation as of 2023, even if the school changed status over that time. The associate and below, one of the challenges when you're looking at community colleges using this data is if a community college gets a bachelor's degree and starts reporting bachelor's completions, they end up reclassified as a 4-year institution instead of a 2-year institution, even though they may be still overwhelmingly associate degrees. So what we've done is we've said, look at the mix of degrees. If it's 95% or more associate and undergrad certificate, put it in associate and below. If it's 95% or more bachelor's and above, put it in 4-year and above. And if it's somewhere in that middle, not 95% either, put it in mixed, which, by the way, is only about 10% of the schools in the country. It's not a big piece. But so that's where you're looking at here. So these are your community colleges and technical colleges, and they have 2/3 of the markets now. And if you remember, the total had stayed the same. So their share has gone up steadily up till about 2019, has been flat ever since. The other dramatic change in this has been the for-profits that went out of business before 2023. They accounted for a significant share of the market, more than 200,000 certificates and degrees awarded back in 2013, and they basically disappeared out of the market by around 2020. Interestingly enough, that red line and this black line look almost like mirror images of each other. It's as if the market share given up by these for-profits that are no longer in business was picked up entirely by community colleges. So that's the spread by sector for associate degrees and below. So if you think about community colleges, most of you, if not all of you, are going to be in this bucket here. There may be a few that offer multiple levels. And then you have the for-profit competition and a tiny bit of not-for-profit. But the shares, actually the for-profit career colleges surviving all of a sudden started growing starting in 2020. So that takes us through the typical programs that community colleges offer. Before we wrap up, I'm going to take you through the bachelor's degree programs, because a lot of your students enter intending to end up transferring into a 4-year school with whatever they've learned and credentials they've earned at the community college. So when you're thinking about your programs, depending on how the destination is doing at the bachelor's level, may or may not point to opportunities for what programs you have or that you might offer. So looking at bachelor's, big story, completions peaked in 2021, as we saw before, and then have declined. One of the big differences looking at this graph versus the ones we looked at for undergrad certificates and associate degrees is that they're not dominated by a few disciplines. Business is biggest and then health, but there's, it's not like the top 2 or 50% of the market the way they are when we looked at certificates. Other ones that are big, engineering and quantitative fields. So think engineering, but also think data science, data analytics, business analytics are heavy in here as well. Science, physics, biology, chemistry, related fields. Family and psychology. Psychology tends to be a huge major at most bachelor's degree schools, and there are a lot of family science things there too that logically fit in. Then the social sciences, then computer related, then all sorts of other things that colleges offer and universities offer. Business is no longer growing, but health, unlike what we saw at the associate and below level, has grown substantially, though even here it looks like that growth may have been mostly through 2019. Engineering and quantitative has grown pretty much steadily all the way through. There's a slight caution on this. Quantitative data analytics and data analytics and data science programs are categorized under multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary programs, which is fine. We pick them out that way. There are a lot of schools that have created concentrations or even relabeled programs that used to be business programs or accounting programs, now calling them business analytics. And for that matter, if they just added a business analytics program, that's going to cannibalize some students who are taking regular business. So some of this increase here is in business analytics. So that may not be a real decrease. That may be, in effect, something could be bucketed in either place, either quantitative or business. But health and engineering quantitative have grown. Science has grown. The psychology has grown slightly, but off a pretty healthy base. Social sciences, computer related, that's IT, computer science, cybersecurity has more than doubled in this time period. Looking at it by the absolute amount of change, the big gainers were health, computer-related, engineering and quantitative programs, and to a lesser extent, science. Other includes everything from agricultural programs and all sorts of miscellaneous things. Pre-law. The biggest drops were in the liberal arts. And as before, these liberal arts programs are the ones that are specific liberal arts disciplines, English, history, languages, and so on. The social sciences, which are somewhat related to that in terms of what the demographics look like and the careers and so on, followed a similar pattern. And education majors have also declined. So that's what's going on in the world of bachelor's degrees. Looking at over a 5-year period rather than 10, what's grown the most? Computer science has added more than 20,000 degrees awarded a year. And that's your general computer science program. Psychology has added about 15,000. And by the way, that percentage-wise, it's a much smaller increase because it's off a much larger base. Business analytics, those of you who are data nerds may know there was no SIP code. There was no 6-digit code for business analytics in 2018. But we've been tracking other business analytics SIP codes. So there's business statistics, there's management science, there's a few others like that. So that's what basically are all would today be categorized as business analytics. So we could track that back historically as well, but very substantial growth. Cybersecurity, percentage-wise, enormous growth, moderate number of amount of completions growth. Public health, if you think about the amount of press that things got during COVID about public health, you saw a big increase here. There may not be clear agreement at different universities about what a bachelor's in public health actually is, because that's evolving. Neuroscience, health services, allied health. We also saw that big on the associate side, I believe, in terms of growth. Nursing, small percentage, but still meaningful overall. Data analytics, again, off a very small base because there was nothing that was an exact match for that earlier. Maybe operations research, which is a pretty small field, and a few others very close to that. So overall, this is what's happened in the last 5 years in terms of which programs have shown the most growth. So if you're thinking about where your graduates might transfer into, something like computer science still is hot. If we look at who has shown the most growth as an institution in terms of number of bachelor's degrees awarded, we've got Southern New Hampshire, Western Governors, Grand Canyon, Arizona State, Capella, Basic, and for that matter, UMGC and Liberty and APUS. So it's basically we're dominated by online programs. So that's where the big growth has been in bachelor's degree programs. Marianne, did we want to do the poll before we move on?
Happy to do so. So we're going to launch a poll. We always like to improve and make sure that we're giving you good value for your time here today. So please take a moment to answer the questions. Thank you.
Marianne, should I continue or should we be paused?
Oh, please continue.
Okay. So let me close that. So if we look at the sectors for bachelor's degrees, this is public colleges and universities. This is your classic state college, state university segment. And the number of completions follows the pattern that we just saw for overall bachelor's completions. The private not-for-profits here, much flatter, but the same general pattern. Then everything else is smaller. The public mixed degree levels are those community colleges, in some cases, who've added bachelor's degrees to the point that's a material number of completions. A lot of those haven't, may have been authorized for bachelor's degrees, but may not have that many completions yet. So you can basically see the pattern here. So for bachelor's, it's very much a public and not-for-profit dominated market, and the publics in particular are a very large share of the total. So to wrap this all up, if you look at the overall trends, total completions peaked in 2021, and now they've become a very slow decline. The associate and bachelor's degrees are what's driving the decline in the last 2 years, dropping 3.8% for associate degrees. That's a significant decline to have to deal with. In contrast, undergrad certificates and grad degrees and certificates have been growing. So the trend in associate degrees is exactly opposite the trend in the undergrad certificates. About 4% a year doesn't feel like a lot till you put a couple of years of that back to back, which we've been doing. And that's a big change from the prior years. When we looked at undergrad certificates, we saw a huge drop in health-related certificates, which ended as a drop by 2019, and it was basically for-profit career colleges where most of the decline was, and these have stabilized, maybe even grown a little since. General studies certificates have grown substantially. not only in California, but that's where the biggest piece of them are, about half of them. I think I saw that Ivy Tech in Indiana also has a significant number. And there's some questions about the reporting of certificates, because it used to be you went to community college, you got either a certificate or an associate degree, it was reported, and that was it. Now there are community colleges that are reporting certificates earned along the way to an associate degree. So from the student's point of view, it's that they were in the associate degree program, but they got earned something partway there. And not all schools are doing that. And not everyone who's actually doing that and awarding the degree is reporting it as an awarded certificate. And the other thing we're seeing is certificates and certifications being added into existing degree programs. And again, it doesn't seem to be consistent of how much that's being reported that way. It seems to be not zero, but it's not consistent. And at the moment, it still seems pretty limited, but it could be distorting some of the trends. And then for associate degrees, we had 8 years of stability, and then we've got this, decline 2 years in a row. And most of that was due to a drop in general studies associate degrees, which tends to be a bread and butter degree at a community college. And that reversed an earlier trend. Health sciences, psychology have grown the most. Part of what's going on there is it may be that people are choosing to have something that sounds more like a major than general studies with the same intent of transfer. Not sure if there's a particular pattern with that or not. We have more webinars coming up next month. Community colleges, October 30th, bachelor's and above, October 31st. That will be back to our regular monthly content of trends, most recent month in our various data sets for employment, enrollment, job postings, and so on, Google searches. So thank you for your attention. If there are any questions, please feel free to reach out to anyone at Gray. We're happy to help.
Thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of the day.